produce a nice solid windowsill. The space, the void, is filled with concrete, and now we're ready for the plasterers to move in. But before we do that, we're going to drill into the joints, the mortar joints, and inject insulation between the outer skin and the inner skin into the cavity. There are various ways of getting insulation into this space, but pumping a granular or foam insulation in is quite a popular and effective way of doing it, particularly if you're, of course, fitting it to a house that's already been built. Where you can access the underside of a roof, such as in the garage, it's easy enough to actually put these bats of fiberglass insulation into position. It's usually spun glass, often recycled glass. The expanded metal being put on here is called a plasterer's bead, and where it's fitted in a position like this is just a mesh. It's really there to just help lock the plaster into position along the edge, but where it's fitted to the outside edge, you can see it's got a solid bead on the corner and then the mesh behind for the plaster to grip. The same applies around a door frame, particularly in the space above, so that the plaster has something to actually cling on to and make a good straight edge along the top of the door. And here you can see the same thing along the edges of a fireplace and all the way around. Typically little sort of dabs of plaster are used to actually hold the plasterer's bead in place, and that's allowed to dry before the final coat of plaster is put on. Here's the first coat of plaster. Note the colour. Notice that it's also applied deliberately quite roughly. This is called a scratch coat because when it's put on, you often deliberately scratch it in order to give a firm basis for the next coat of plaster, the finishing coat of plaster. Now in this particular house, the finishing coat is going to be put on using this type of plaster here. Now Carlite is just a manufacturer's name. It's like Blue Circle Cement or something. It's not a particular type. This is simply known as finishing plaster or pink plaster. Here are trestles that have been built up in place for the plasterers to reach the ceiling and the tops of the walls, and as you can see they've been pretty busy applying the final coat, the Carlite coat, to the ceiling. You can see the pink colour I referred to, and you can see how lovely and smooth that finished coat is. It's a really skilled job getting this on. A thin skim, 3mm skim of plaster over everything, making for a very, very smooth finished wall which could be painted or perhaps papered depending on what you want.